In old times, during the 1800s, England joined in trading with many faraway lands. They began bringing home fine silks and fragrant spices from colonies overseas. But by accident, they also brought back a terrible sickness, a virus that turned people into zombies. Before long, these monsters were roaming all over the country. At first, folks didn't know what was happening. Millions died and some rose again, as living corpses hungry for human brains. The few who stayed well soon looked for help far away. They learned deadly fighting skills from masters in China and Japan, hoping to win back their land. As the zombie plague spread, the government decided to protect London in the only way they could. They built a huge wall 100 feet tall around the whole city. Outside that wall, they dug a very deep ditch all the way around. That moat, called the Royal Canal, made it hard for zombies to get in. The narrow land between wall and ditch became known as the in-between. One day near Kent, a big fight broke out over one of the canal's bridges. Zombies smashed through and swarmed the in-between, killing every villager there. This horror made the king lose his mind. After that battle, he ordered every bridge torn down, except one. Lords and ladies grew afraid and moved out of London, each into its own strong estate. Sometime later, Colonel Darcy rode into Hertfordshire County to visit one of those estates. He had word that someone there might already be changing into a zombie. A guard at the gate checked his papers, then led him down a long tunnel. A priest waited inside and looked carefully at Darcy's bare skin. When he saw no bite marks, the priest let Darcy pass. At last, Darcy came into the big house. Inside, Mrs. Featherstone was playing cards with friends in her drawing room. She smiled and swore that no one in her home was sick, and not a single zombie had ever crossed her lands. Feigning curiosity, Darcy sat at the card table as if he might join the game. Instead, he pulled out a small glass vial full of wriggling carrion flies. "These flies can find dying flesh," he explained softly, then cracked the vial open. In a flash, the flies darted around the room, then settled on one man's coat. "That means he's becoming a zombie," Darcy said. Without hesitation, he smashed his glass vial on the floor and drew a long blade. With one quick thrust, he stabbed the man's face, then swung hard and cut off his head. The stunned guests gasped. Darcy wiped his blade, then asked Mrs. Featherstone, "Could this man have bitten anyone here?" She shook her head. Darcy marched over, kicked the bloody head aside, and left at once, scandalizing everyone. Just then, Mrs. Featherstone's young daughter ran in, her face pale. She insisted on checking the sick man's niece upstairs, but she was too late. The niece already had turned and attacked the servants. In one terrible moment, she pounced on her own cousin and sank her teeth in. Meanwhile, in a nearby village, Mr. Bennet was busy teaching his 5 daughters every weapon trick he knew: swords, knives, staffs, even hand-to-hand holds. He wanted them ready if zombies ever found their home. But Mrs. Bennet was furious. She wanted them to learn polite manners and find good husbands instead. When Mrs. Bennet heard about a grand dance coming up, she saw an opportunity. She begged Mr. Bennet to let the girls go and enjoy a night of music and fun. Eager for a break, he agreed. The sisters buzzed with excitement, except Elizabeth, who found parties dull. On the day of the dance, they all dressed in their finest gowns, but hid small blades under their skirts. In the ballroom, Mr. Bingley chatted happily with Colonel Darcy. Suddenly, Bingley spotted Jane across the room and froze. He was hopelessly in love at first sight. He asked her to dance, and they laughed and spun all evening. Later, Bingley teased Darcy to dance too. Darcy shrugged. "Miss Elizabeth, she's pleasing enough, but not pretty enough to tempt me." Elizabeth, who overheard, stormed away in anger. In her upset hurry, she tripped and knocked over a wine bottle, splashing everyone. Outside the hall, Elizabeth wept softly until she saw Mrs. Featherstone shambling toward her, a glazed look in her dead eyes. Before the girl could speak, Darcy raised his pistol and shot her in the head. The loud crack brought house guards running out. Then another zombie trailed in, and bells rang to warn of attack. Most guests fled inside and barricaded doors. But the Bennet sisters drew their hidden blades and rushed to fight. They struck quickly, cutting zombie arms with neat slashes, then kicked them in the head to finish. Elizabeth's fierce skill drew Darcy's gaze. She looked brave and strong. Suddenly, he saw her in a new light. When the battle ended, all the zombie bodies were burned by torchlight. At home, Jane gushed about Bingley's charm. Elizabeth, still shaken, grumbled about Darcy's haughty words, practicing sword swings with extra force. The next morning, a messenger brought Jane an invitation for tea at Bingley's grand house. Mrs. Bennet insisted Jane ride horseback rather than by coach, so that if it rained, she might stay the night. On her way, Jane's horse bolted at the sight of straggling dogs. Dogs hunting a lone zombie. The horse threw her off. Jane reached for her flintlock, but the gun misfired and burned her hand. The zombie lunged. Jane drew her dagger and fought hand to hand, slicing off its hands, then kicking its ribs. When it fell, she stamped its skull until it no longer moved. Rain began, and Jane froze in the downpour. From the edge of the woods wandered a zombie mother, cradling a whimpering infected baby. Jane stood her ground, heart pounding. The next morning, Elizabeth rode to Bingley's house. The night's rain left muddy tracks, and Darcy waited anxiously in the yard. A doctor examined Jane for a bite. Darcy released more carrion flies in the room. They fluttered and found no sign of rotting flesh. Elizabeth, seeing this, caught the flies in her hand and crushed them, then handed Darcy the empty vial with a sharp look. Later at the breakfast table, Bingley urged Jane to join a card game. She politely declined. Reading books suited her better. A debate broke out among the guests over what makes a proper woman. Darcy listened in confusion, unsure if he admired or despised Jane's quiet strength. That night, Elizabeth sneaked outside to watch Darcy practice sword drills. At dawn, the rest of the Bennets arrived to fetch Jane. Bingley begged them to stay, but Darcy warned of infection risk. Elizabeth and he quarreled over his cold caution, and Mrs. Bennet hurried to smooth things over. She coaxed Bingley to host a gala ball soon to lift spirits. On the road home, the sisters saw the old orphanage ruin. Zombie orphans wandered the wood edges, reaching for them. They spat curses as Bingley's new soldiers marched by to guard the region. A few days later, Mr. Bennet introduced them to their cousin, Mr. Collins, the heir to his estate. Women could not inherit. Collins spoke of his patroness, Lady Catherine, an expert swordswoman who had done great deeds in the zombie war. He showed mild interest in Jane, but Mrs. Bennet shooed him off, declaring Jane already had Bingley. Instead, she suggested he court Elizabeth. That afternoon, Collins and the sisters set out to visit Lady Catherine's home. On the road, they discovered a broken carriage and the muffled screams of a woman inside. The sisters whipped out their blades, but the woman was not a lady in distress. She was a zombie. Jane finished her with a swift kick that sent her rolling down the hill. The ride went on. Elizabeth staggered under the weight of armaments, but Collins only piled on more weapons instead of helping. When they reached town, new battalions of soldiers stood ready at the gates. Elizabeth met Lieutenant Wickham, a friendly officer who charmed her. Darcy watched from a distance, burning with jealousy, and slipped away without a word. Wickham told Elizabeth that he and Darcy had old family debts between them, money disputes that left their friendship broken. That evening at the ball, Jane danced with Bingley. Elizabeth tried to talk with Wickham, but Collins dragged her onto the dance floor instead, flailing her limbs with too much zeal. Darcy later asked Elizabeth for a dance, but Collins butted in awkwardly and ruined the moment. As Darcy left the hall, he overheard Mrs. Bennet boasting about Jane's future fortune with Bingley. He stiffened, angered by talk of money. Suddenly, a harsh cry rang out. A servant in the corridor was being attacked by a zombie. Elizabeth and Bingley grabbed axes and sprinted toward the noise. The zombie threw Bingley to the floor. Elizabeth slid down the banister and knocked the creature off. She turned and saw dozens of zombie children pouring in through a side door. "Our new friend showed them the way," one boy mumbled. At that moment, Darcy reappeared, sword in hand. He cut through the little monsters with swift slashes, and even shoved one into the oven to burn. He turned to Bingley, ready to execute him if bitten, but Elizabeth assured him her friend was safe. "You're a fine fighter," Darcy said quietly, "but you treat friends badly." At lunchtime, Collins made a formal marriage proposal to Elizabeth, but it came with a condition. She must give up all weapons training and never fight zombies again. Elizabeth refused. As soon as she left the table, she rushed outside and practiced sword cuts to calm her anger. Mrs. Bennet scolded her, but Mr. Bennet quietly nodded his approval. Later that afternoon, Elizabeth walked through the woods alone. Overhead, 4 black birds swooped like silent messengers. Ahead, she found Wickham waiting. When she turned back, the birds were gone. "I didn't see anything," Wickham said, smiling. He invited her deeper into the forest. They came to a hidden chapel. Inside, a priest read from an old book, while dozens of walking dead sat on benches listening. As the undead rose to see her, the priest served them pig's brains in porcelain bowls. They still keep part of themselves if they don't eat human brains, Wickham whispered. Maybe we can find peace with them. Elizabeth thought, this could change the war. She told Wickham they must bring this idea to the crown. But Wickham shook his head. The war had drained the treasury. No one in power would listen. A few days later, Elizabeth learned her friend was engaged to Collins and needed a chaperone. The family rode to Collins' estate. There, Elizabeth saw a painting of Lady Catherine slaying Lucifer and another of the 4 horsemen of the zombie apocalypse, omens said to appear before the end of days. Suddenly, she recognized those figures as the same 4 birds she'd chased. Soon, Lady Catherine herself arrived in a grand coach, followed by her daughter, and there was Colonel Darcy, standing stiffly by her side. She realized he was Catherine's nephew. Wickham joined them too, thanking Elizabeth for the invitation so he could plead for funds to aid his peace plan. Lady Catherine laughed at the idea of befriending zombies. They would never obey orders, she said. Collins spoke up. The Bible says an antichrist shall lead the dead. Darcy slammed his fist, furious. Guards seized Wickham and dragged him away. You are as cold as the dead, Elizabeth spat at Darcy. That night, Darcy trained by moonlight, blade slicing silent air. Elizabeth, sleepless, wandered into the palace gardens. There she found Wickham, still bruised. He told her Darcy had lied to Bingley. He warned the family that Jane prized their money, so they fled. Wickham asked her to run off with him, but she refused. The reckoning is near, he warned, vanishing into shadows. The next morning, Darcy sought Elizabeth in the courtyard. I find you beneath me, he began, and yet I cannot turn from you. Will you marry me? Elizabeth laughed scornfully and named all his faults, how he drove Bingley away and left Jane heartbroken. Darcy defended himself coldly. She kicked him, threw a poker at him, and he parried. Their words turned to blows and they grappled atop a long table. Elizabeth shrieked, I will never marry you! Darcy shoved her, and she stumbled to the floor, shaken. He brushed past, leaving her in tears. Days passed. Elizabeth found a letter from Darcy. He explained he never meant to hurt Jane. He only wanted to shield her from Mrs. Bennet's frantic schemes. He told how he had to slay his own father when he turned. He had given Wickham the money promised to him, but Wickham kept begging. Wickham even tried to seduce Darcy's sister for more funds, and Darcy had rescued her. He wrote that he respected Elizabeth's feelings and had ridden to London to fight a fresh zombie onslaught. He suspected someone was controlling the hordes. They moved too systematically. When Elizabeth returned home, panic met her. Wickham had run off with Lydia, her youngest sister. She feared they'd been taken to that zombie chapel. That night, Lady Catherine arrived with guards. She announced a decree. If Elizabeth did not accept Darcy's hand, Darcy would wed Catherine's daughter instead. Elizabeth found herself thinking kindly of Darcy for the first time, but still could not promise marriage. Catherine, annoyed, challenged Elizabeth to a duel with her strongest guard. The man was huge. He punched and blocked her swings easily. Elizabeth refused to yield, slashing his arm. With a fierce kick, she sent him crashing into a beam, which broke and dropped rubble onto him. He lay stunned. Catherine stepped forward with 2 swords. Frances, as poised as ever, pinned Elizabeth to the wall, then lowered her blades. I respect your spirit, she said. At that moment, Mr. Bennet burst in. No more bloodshed. Your sister's life is in danger. Jane volunteered to rescue Lydia, but Elizabeth insisted Jane must stay behind and keep the family safe. Catherine offered them horses and a small guard to ride out at dawn. They reached the bridge, but soldiers stood ready. Tomorrow morning, we'll blow up this bridge and stop the horde once and for all, an officer announced. Elizabeth and Jane ignored him and rode on. Meanwhile, on the battlefield, Bingley stood on a trench wall, dropping bombs into the zombie mass below. One snagged his scarf and dragged him perilously close to an explosion. Jane, out scouting, saw him in trouble. She raced in, slashed the scarf, and shoved him to safety. Nearby, Darcy thrust his sword down into an undead giant's skull, only to see dozens of black hands bursting from the earth. A hulking zombie loomed, ready to crush him. Elizabeth sprang in, swung her axe with all her might, and split its head open. "We're standing on a graveyard," she panted. "They're waking up all around us." They stabbed the ground, smashing skulls and ripping limbs until the earth lay still. Breathless, Elizabeth told Darcy about Lydia in the chapel. Darcy's eyes darkened. "They burned the building 5 days ago," he said, but she sensed a lie. She kicked out. Darcy turned, caught her fist. "Why lie?" she cried. He looked away. "I worried you'd go alone and get killed." Elizabeth rode ahead toward the church. As she galloped past the camp, she saw the smoke rising from London behind her, black towers aflame. 4 men on horseback, their hats tall and black, herded a massive zombie horde behind them. She recoiled, but when she looked back, the riders were gone. At the ruined chapel doors, Darcy found Lydia chained inside. On the wall, he read Wickham's plan: to march the dead on London's gates. A shot rang out. Wickham stepped from the shadows, pistol in hand. "I'm the Antichrist," he hissed. "These horsemen are my army." Darcy offered him money to free Lydia. Wickham laughed and fired at the lock. The shot rang through the chapel, stirring the horde outside. "Stop!" Darcy cried, but too late. The zombies smashed through the doors. Darcy dove onto Lydia, breaking her bonds. His stallion reared and burst through a barred window. Darcy lifted Lydia onto its back and sent her to the bridge. Wickham and Darcy circled each other as zombies poured in. Sparks flew as blade met blade. Wickham fought with unholy speed. He was already half a monster. He tackled Darcy and began to choke him. Elizabeth thundered in on horseback. She swung her sword and cut off Wickham's arm. The horse reared, pinning him under its hooves. Elizabeth leapt down and finished him with a single stroke. Smoke and fire swirled outside. Elizabeth grabbed Darcy's hand and shoved him onto her horse. Together they spurred through the crowd of dead, racing for the bridge as the explosives' fuses hissed. They reached the center just as the soldiers flipped the switch. A thunderous blast lit the sky. Elizabeth fell to the ground, braced for death. When the smoke cleared, she saw shards of wood and iron. Beneath the rubble lay Darcy, unconscious but alive. She raced to him, cradled his head, and whispered, "I love you." Days later, a carriage arrived at the Bennett home. Bingley stepped out and bowed. "Miss Jane, will you marry me?" Jane blushed and nodded. Inside his own room, Darcy awoke from his coma. He whispered Elizabeth's name. She rushed in, threw her arms around him, and he asked, "Will you be my wife?" She kissed him and said yes. That afternoon, both weddings were held together in the village church. Mr. Collins read the vows. Jane and Bingley smiled. Elizabeth and Darcy beamed. As the newlyweds stepped from the church into sunlight, laughter and cheers ringing in their ears, a shadow darkened the doorway. Wickham, no longer human, half zombie, stood with a fresh horde at his back. Join next time for another story that makes you think and feel. Until then, stay curious and stay safe.